As a test prep provider, I am often fielding the question from families, which test should we take? Should we take the SAT or is the ACT a better fit? To begin with, I want to reassure you that all colleges that accept scores do accept either the SAT or the ACT. It truly is the student's preference. Now, because college admissions policies are always shifting, I would encourage you to look into any schools that you know are on your list or any particular programs, because if there are any limitations, it tends to be from the very specific kinds of programs that you might be applying to. But by and large, if you're going general admissions, you can take either the SAT or the ACT, and it makes no difference to the colleges. Now, when you start to put the SAT and the ACT side by side, it can look confusing. Sometimes people say, oh, they're exactly the same test. You can take either. And sometimes they'll say, well, they're wildly different, and so you must choose wisely. I'm more in the latter camp. These are not exactly the same test, even though on paper, what they test looks very similar. So let's start with what I think is the number one difference between the SAT and the ACT, and that is tone. Most people go to timing first, and while it's true that the SAT generally has more time per question than the ACT, it's also true that the SAT has a much more complex tone. The way that they write their questions is far more convoluted, so students who struggle with reading comprehension, let's say, are going to struggle with a lot of the problems on the SAT, or it will take that extra time for them to understand the problems. And that's not just a reading specific issue. That also trickles down into the math that is very word-based on the SAT. The ACT, on the other hand, is fairly straightforward. We have very clear questions that generally pertain to pretty straightforward language in any passages being considered at any given time, and so maybe the extra time doesn't actually confer a benefit. As an adult who still takes these tests myself, I can tell you they feel very different, and the pacing feels very different, and not necessarily to the advantage of the ACT. Because the ACT is more clear-cut, I can get through it faster. So to me, considering the tone of these exams, much more complex and convoluted on the SAT side and much more straightforward on the ACT side is far more important than knowing how many minutes per question I get. So that's definitely my number one tip, to wrap your head around the tone of the two exams and figure out which one fits your student best. The second consideration you should take into account is the math. On paper, they cover the exact same range of topics, everything from arithmetic all the way up to pre-calc. That said, the SAT has a much more narrow but deep emphasis on algebraic understanding. If you're taking the SAT, you're going to be using algebra in the majority of the questions. Are there geometry questions on the SAT? Absolutely. But by and large, the majority of questions really focus on students having a faculty with algebra, reading word problems, translating them into equations and expressions, and solving. Sometimes by hand, because on the SAT there are two math sections, in one of which you cannot use a calculator. On the other side, on the ACT, it's wide but shallow. While they have a more even distribution of topics, it's not as heavily weighted in the favor of algebra. It's wide. You have to have a confidence with a lot more math in order to achieve the score you're looking for. So they're two very different prospects. You do need to consider which way you would prefer to go. And I will tell you, a lot of the shortcuts, the back solving and things like that do work on the ACT, where they are not necessarily as applicable on the SAT anymore. They used to be, but now that they have open response questions on this version of the exam, it's not quite the same. So if you think you are a student who needs to rely on that, you don't feel comfortable or confident in math, one math section where you can have a calculator all the way through may be the way to go, as opposed to the SAT's 2 sections, one of which you cannot use a calculator. It really depends on the student, and that's a conversation, again, that you really should be having as you're considering which test to take. The third consideration is science versus reading. Now, this is not an exact equivalent because the ACT does have a reading section, but in ACT form, it's much more straightforward than the SAT's reading section. The ACT, however, has a science section. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about ACT science. ACT science does not require you to have a lot of outside knowledge of science in order to answer it. Instead, it's more of an open book test where you're asked to read charts and graphs and interpret a scientific scenario and answer questions. There may be 1, at most 2 questions that require outside knowledge, but because we never know which branch of science these questions are going to come from, it's really not a factor. It doesn't generally impact your score unless you're well above a 32 every single time. Now, on the flip side, on the reading, on the ACT, you have some beefy passages. A lot of them are historically based, and a lot of them are very complex, true to the SAT's tone. So the question really becomes, do you prefer to sift through very dense language in the reading and figure out the answers to questions there? Or would you prefer to read charts and graphs and be very flexible with the science section, where you really are improvising based on what they're presenting you every single time? Very different challenges. Which one do you prefer? And just as a little side note, do know that you won't be off the hook for science questions on the SAT. There are always a few graph-based questions that are sprinkled throughout the reading and the writing section on the SAT, which brings up a sort of sub-consideration, which is, are you okay shifting the skill that you're using? Would you rather be in a pool where you're going, this is what I'm doing right now, and I'm only doing science in this section? Or are you okay with shifting gears for a few questions over in the reading and the writing? Focusing on verbal skills and all of a sudden needing to read a data table or a chart, every student is different, and the answer to that question is different, and depending on what your answer is, you're going to be on a different side of the ACT or SAT line. At the end of all of this, if you're still on the fence, really the best way to tell is not fun or an awesome thing to get to do on a Saturday, but it is to take some practice tests. And when I say that, I don't mean going to take the real exams, okay? Please hear me. You do not want to take a real exam cold or just to see how you're going to do, because those test scores can end up on your college applications. Instead, take a free one that you can print out online and take at your kitchen table. Zero pressure. Nothing hinges on it. You can just take it and see how you feel. The good news is, if you've already taken a PSAT, you sort of have a sense of how the SAT will go. All you have to do then is take the ACT. If you haven't taken the PSAT, you'll want to take both, but for heaven's sake, don't do them on the same day. Split them up. Do them a weekend, a half or 2 weekends apart so that you have a little bit of rest, and then you can compare the scores and also compare your feelings about the exams and make the choice that's right for you. If you want access to our full-length free practice tests, 2 for the SAT and 2 for the ACT, you can click the button below and sign up for my 15 free test prep tools. There are other resources in there, but those full-length practice tests are a great place to get started to figure out which exam you prefer to take. So go ahead, click the button below to sign up, and I'll see you in your inbox.